There we are. By the way, we're not recording the chats, only the video. But yeah, let us know if you want to be excluded at the moment that you are maybe contributing to the discussion. So Alex, welcome. Great that you are that you're here online. I think we didn't meet in person, but mostly online, also via some colleagues. What I want to do with you to start is also to really understand the context of the market in Australia, how this is happening. Because I think if you want to also know, okay, so what can we learn from this for different regions in the world, it's also important to understand this context. So my first question is to, can you give a bit of context on the markets where the conversation is part of?
Yeah, no, thanks, Martijn, and thanks for having myself and Jack today. I want to do something very Australian, and that's, I guess, acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today. It's something that we do to, I guess, acknowledge the fact that the lands on which we're meeting, like here in Australia, we're never ceded. So I'm currently on Wongal/Gadigal lands. The University of Sydney is based on Gadigal land, and want to pay my respects to the traditional owners, past, present, and emerging. So to get to your question, Martijn, I think it's really important sort of acknowledge, sorry, there's a dog being slightly disruptive here. I want to acknowledge that it's really important to recognize, I guess, the history of the Australian employment/industrial relations system to appreciate where we got to in terms of regulating gig work. So there's a few things I think for an international audience in particular that are useful to keep in mind. So Australia is a federation of states, but what we've seen over time is that although the states originally had rights and responsibilities in relation to industrial and workplace relations matters, over time we've seen an increasingly nationalized system. But going back to the Federation of Australia, one of the things that is quite striking about the Australian system is that we've always seen quite significant levels of state intervention. And the mechanism of state intervention that we've seen has quite often been through the use of industrial relations courts and tribunals. And today, Jack will be speaking about the interactions and the role that the Fair Work Commission plays with setting minimum standards for gig workers. But that is very much in line with how the Australian state has traditionally responded and intervened in relation to any forms of work and industrial issues. So in that respect, the Australian approach to regulating gig work is a uniquely Australian way of going about it. And the Fair Work Commission, its origins can be traced back basically to federation. So it's an industrial workplace relations umpire that has been part of the system for over a century now. And so it's really important to appreciate that sort of local context. I think what we've seen is a long period here in Australia where successive, particularly conservative governments have very little interest in terms of improving working conditions for gig workers. Effectively, we saw the first gig platforms entering the market here in the early 2010s. And as Jack will speak to, he's been involved with some of the major food delivery and rideshare platforms for quite significant period of time. But effectively, the position of successive Australian governments was that it was really a matter for individual workers, their representatives, to take to the industrial umpire, to the Fair Work Commission or the relevant courts to try and determine whether or not gig work should be employment or contracting. We've seen over time quite a few cases, but effectively what happened was that because of the way in which some high court decisions that didn't directly relate to gig work reinterpreted the industrial relations system here, which meant that rather than looking at how the relationship operated in practice, we started looking at what was happening in the contract. Basically, our current Albanese Labour government basically formed the view that intervention and significant changes were necessary. Jack and his union played a significant role in some of the lobbying activities around this, and I'm sure that he'll talk more about this. But effectively, what we've seen is through the introduction of the Closing Loopholes Bill #2, this creation of what is effectively a third category of work into the Australian employment relations system. Compared to some other jurisdictions across the world, we always basically had a binary system between independent contracting and employment with all the rights and protections, contracting without any. Now we've got a new intermediate but highly demarcated third category called regulated work. It's comprised of two sort of streams. On the one hand side, we've got the transport workers, for which Jack's union also has coverage, as well as your digital employee-like workers, basically your platform workers, but it's only a select number of platforms based on certain criteria that can basically be captured by these reforms. So I think that sort of sets them a bit of a historical context, but also a bit of an overview of why did we end up with the type of intervention that we did in Australia. And I think it's perhaps useful to bring in Jack to talk a little bit more about his union and their role in creating this new jurisdiction.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Alex, for this introduction. And I also want to ask Jack to, you're already here, but also to Valeria to also spotlight Jack to this conversation, because now we're going to the insights from Jack from the union, the Transport Workers Union of Australia. So Jack, also great you're here. So the Transport Workers Union has been around for more than 140 years, you told me when we met previously. So what characterizes this union, and how does it also help to focus on the nature of conditions of work rather than of the contractual status of the workers, which is in most regions in the world, especially in the global north, one of the main discussions?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Martin, and pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for having me on and giving us the opportunity to share a little bit about our work here in Australia. I was saying to Martin, one of the unfortunate things about presenting is I don't get to learn from obviously what's happening in many other parts of the world. So if I could just foreshadow this discussion by saying we are very keen to learn from other jurisdictions. I think Martin and I were making the comment that, with challenges as big as this and posing such an existential threat to the union movement, to the extent that we in the labour movement, in unions directly, but also within academia, can be exchanging information, having forums like this across the world to make sure we are doing everything we can to ensure a better future for these workers and our movement more broadly. That work is incredibly important. So thank you. Transport Workers Union of Australia. Yes, we are very old, 140 years old. We are one of the oldest unions in Australia. Really important, and this will surprise some people, but it's incredibly important in understanding structurally our approach to this, the challenges presented by the gig economy today. We were founded by workers that looked very much like gig workers 140 years ago. We were founded by what was called back then draymen, trolleymen, and carters. They were workers that would work with quite literally a trolley in hand, transporting goods, or carts tied with horses. They would wait by the side of the road. They were not paid an hourly wage. They would perform work on a job-by-job basis. By the people who engaged them, they were called businesses, and that kind of discussion was used to deny them basic work rights and conditions. And a consequence of that is they had incredibly bad standards, they had incredibly insecure work, and it led to really dangerous outcomes for those workers. In that context and in that situation, those workers started to band together and collectivise to form what would then become the first makings of what is today the Transport Workers Union. And that is really important because for the rest of our history, we have always, of course, grew to represent employees, but we have always had the capacity to unionise non-standard forms of workers, contractors. There's a lot of them in transport, many different forms over our history, owner-driver, truck drivers, couriers and the like. who may be called a business, may be self-employed, but do not have effective bargaining power, and because of that, have very poor conditions at times and have an interest in unionising, collectivising to improve those conditions. So that's a bit about the TW and our history, and I'll stop there, Martin, because I know you have other questions where I'll go to the rest of it.
Yeah, thanks for this introduction. I think the context that you, but also Alex also brought is important to understand why things happening and could happen, which is happening right now. You already mentioned the gig economy or platform economy as a biggest threat. So what's caused you to become concerned about platform work? And what were also your observations and concerns over there?
Yeah, well, look, coming from the perspective of the Transport Workers Union, and sorry, just to be clear, we represent all workers across the road transport industry here, employed, non-employed, contractors, and the like, also aviation workers in Australia. We've always seen in the road transport industry in particular, when you don't have minimum standards, and particularly when you have groups of fragmented, insecure workers in those contracting arrangements, industry pressures lead to really dangerous outcomes. We see people having to rush to get by. We see, especially when low pay is factored in, people having to work unsustainable levels of hours under fatigue just to make ends meet. We see particularly contractors forgoing really important and vital maintenance on their vehicles. And the consequence of that is in Australia, we are the deadliest industry to work in. If you are a road transport worker, you are 10 times more likely to be killed at work than any other worker. It is not a sustainable industry. The competition is so fierce because of the fragmentation in our industry that many businesses are suffering too. They are going insolvent. Every year we could kind of top the tallies in terms of insolvencies. So terrible outcomes for workers, terrible outcomes for businesses. Enter the platform economy in 2011. Then it was dubbed the sharing economy. And of course, it started right in the heart of transport in rideshare, devastating standards for what was then an industry dominated by taxis. It grew then into the delivery market and then evolved from food to parcel delivery. And we're seeing it start to come in, particularly here in trucking as well, and heavy freight movements. We were well accustomed to non-standard forms of work without standards, leading to really worrying implications. But I think even we were surprised when we went out and started to survey, particularly workers in 2018 in the food delivery industry. We found just in that first survey, after costs, they on average got paid less than half the minimum wage. So the minimum wage in Australia at the time was roughly $22 an hour. They were paid $10 an hour after we deducted for work expenses and costs. 70% of workers we surveyed said they worried about being seriously hurt or killed every day when they went to work. And 33%, 1/3, said that they had been seriously hurt or injured at work. So we could instantly see that connection between an absence of standards, intense economic pressures, and really dangerous outcomes for workers in the industry. But the thing that made that all the most alarming is half of these workers had only worked for a year. So within a year, 1/3 of workers just about were saying they'd been seriously hurt or injured. It was absolutely alarming, and it just became clear to us that we really had to devote our attention to this sector in the road transport industry for those workers, but also for broader industry standards, because as this model expanded, we knew it would have a race to the bottom effect throughout standards throughout the broader industry as well.
And what were also the concerns on the technology parts of the gig economy? That you also mentioned some or saw some there.
Of course, and such a great point. Thank you for mentioning it, Martin. Of course, what was new, a lot of this wasn't new. I mean, it was a contractor model, absence of standards, using a loophole to undercut basic conditions and industrial rights. What was new is that built on top of that were algorithmic pressures, which were managing and pushing and prodding and threatening and surveilling workers in ways that were unprecedented. So that was genuinely new. And I think some of those more alarming, really intense outcomes when it came to safety and when it came to working conditions were compounded by some of those new age forms of control, surveillance, and
Yeah.
performance management.
Yeah, agree. And maybe it's also different that maybe it's also more shifted from to business to consumer markets, or so the end clients with gig platform work are in many times also consumers, which also maybe has a different view on working conditions than businesses. Do you see any difference in that?
Sorry, your point is that consumers were directly engaging the workers?
Yeah.
Look, there are obvious differences with that. There are also other traditional road transport markets which operated similarly. So we had, for example, express couriers that were engaged by large numbers of small companies across cities and streetscapes. It's definitely an important dynamic, and I think you're right. It did make at least the political and regulatory discussion about it a little bit more nuanced, because of course one of the positions the platforms would put forward is they were just an intermediary. They weren't the ones that were actually directing this market. This was consumers making decisions, and they were just facilitating those kind of engagements.
Yeah. We know the framing of these conversations all over the world. Interesting to see. So the journey towards the minimum standards began in 2018 already. I understood when we had this prep discussion. So could you also describe what this process looked like and what steps did you took to reach the point where everyone, including the platforms, felt a kind of sense of urgency to take action to talk about minimum standards for workers in delivery and last mile delivery?
Yeah, look, first, can I say anything I say now, I just want to make absolutely clear, it is important that unions, labour activists, academics, people more broadly in the labour movement are doing whatever they can to advance the interests of some of the most impoverished, exploited workers in our economies. We've got a view about the most effective way to do that in the context of Australia and based on our experience. Others will have different views. But for us, what became really clear to us from the outset were two things. One, we had to ensure regulation that enabled us to apply industry standards. There was no point having, even if after years of campaigning, we got one platform to a point where we could sign an agreement or another, we knew that wasn't going to be a good outcome, most likely for workers. It probably wasn't going to be as sustainable because the market itself would remain unregulated. So that was the first fundamental point for us. The second was we knew, and really critical to effective union campaigns, workers had to be at the centre of that campaign. We had to have some kind of a approach to organising workers and making sure they were involved in every step of the campaign. If we weren't able to do that, we weren't going to be able to really convince the decision makers we needed to convince, but also capture the public narrative in the way we needed to change the laws of this country and affect change. So they were our initial goals. Just really quickly, we talk about, in the terms of our union, comprehensive campaigning, which effectively means we look to amplify worker organising with media pressure and strategies, community engagement strategies, political pressure, legal pressure, and direct action where we can. And it was quite literally all those things over the next 8 years of campaigning, which led us into the position we are today. In terms of media, we quite tragically kept having so many workers killed in the food delivery sector. And every single time that happened, it was horrible, but it was also an opportunity to use that as an example of why we needed minimum standards in this industry and why the government needed to act to change the laws. The start of this campaign, Conservative government, so they weren't very responsive, but it built pressure and it started to shift the public narrative around the need for change. That provided then us a capacity to start to engage politically, particularly with the then opposition, the Labor government, around policy that they would begin to develop and prepare for a time at which they would come to government. It was not an easy conversation. There were lots of different views about how to regulate this particular industry. And as you all know, that can be quite an interesting debate in different circles and forums. But we were able to progress that process over the years while we were having that very physical public debate. the same time, we knew we had to exert maximum pressure on these platforms themselves. We started to engage in legal test cases to, much like many unions across the globe, to say that these workers must be classified as employees. Now, we didn't take on those test cases with the view that, one, that would be an effective strategy, because I could speak about that, but there are issues with how long that process takes. On the other end of that outcome, how platforms can then just change their contractual arrangements to avoid reclassification. But it was incredibly effective in placing pressure on them, but also being able to, again, campaign publicly around those cases and really bring to the public for the fact that workers were being deactivated for a safety issue, or refusing to perform work that they didn't want to, despite these platforms complaining that the work was flexible and these were entrepreneurs. So there were all these interesting discussions we could pull out through those test cases. And we had direct worker action. It was incredibly important. Small, high visibility actions, protests outside key points of offices, key delivery worker hubs, rideshare hubs, airports. There's been dozens upon dozens over the years, and we've kind of aligned those with key government inquiries, key legal proceedings, obviously when workers have tragically been killed, memorials, or to focus public attention and build pressure along the way. All that campaigning got us to a point in 2024 where we finally managed to build enough pressure on these platforms to have them agree to supporting regulation that would ensure industry standards. This is really important. We did not sign an agreement with these platforms that would change things at one company or the next. It was about getting them to commit to join us in supporting government calls for regulation that would set industry-wide standards. Now, that then laid the platform, when the government changed, for us to effectively ensure the urgent introduction of those laws. I can go into what those laws look like and how we're using them, but that effectively is where we started in 2018, the kind of campaigning work we did to elevate this as an issue, place pressure on those platforms, and where we got those platforms to in order to deliver the legislation that we now enjoy in Australia.
Yeah, it's very interesting process. And also see that you're also really using multiple instruments, but also and really engaged with the workers, where I've also seen many struggle in contacting the workers and engaging them into, because it's such a heterogeneous population, and also many times just working for a couple of months or years in the industry. So one question before we go to what those minimum standards now are. A in between question. So because there used to also be a third big platform in a food delivery platform in Australia, a Menulog. And then there was also discussions about the employment model. So should the workers be employed? And in the end, there was a decision made to create the separate category of the employee-like worker. So what were the considerations of not in the end choosing for the employee model and go for the employee-like worker category?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. First, we actually had a few more platforms. Deliveroo was in the country, Fedora was in the country, both of those exited. Menulog recently exited the country, citing competitive pressures and a lack of sustainability. But Menulog was really interesting because they were obviously pursuing employment models. I say employment because there was issues around how they created those models and the standards they were offering through them, particularly in some European jurisdictions, which I know you are across, but they sought to take a similar approach in Australia. And they announced this at a government inquiry and effectively committed to work with the union to deliver that outcome. And we thought, conceptually great, this is never going to work. And it's never going to work for two reasons. One, what they were effectively trying to do was offer a form of employment that would be underpinned by a different kind of employment standards by creating a new award. And that award would kind of take employment standards just a little bit lower in some respects and introduce some different flexibilities. Now, we would have very little capacity once that award was created to improve those standards. The tribunal was actually really, it's part of the conservative attacks Alex Veen was talking about a moment ago, has really been watered down in lifting those standards. But most importantly, we knew that just lifting Menulog up here wasn't going to deal with the majority of the market, which was Uber Eats and some of these other platforms at the time. And to the extent that Menulog was actually offering better standards and conditions, if we weren't able to lift up the rest of the market, which was engaging contractors, then it was only a matter of time before Menulog, exited the country, citing competitive pressures, which they did eventually. So we provided that view to Menulog. For whatever reason, they pressed on. We opposed the application for those reasons. Obviously we wanted to improve working conditions, but it was about ensuring sustainable outcomes. And we ended up tragically seeing Menulog, which was trying to do some good things conceptually, but just didn't have the right approach, being pushed out of the Australian market.
Yeah, clear. So thanks for that. I also see the question of voice act, but I will come back to that later because it also fits in two questions of this one. So first, maybe good to go about the proposal for minimum standards. This is now have been put forward. Can you explain which topics are covered within this proposal for minimum standards?
Just before I can answer that question, I'll just say a few points on the system itself, which will flow to the applications, if that's. So in terms of the system we have here, it's really important. Conceptually, we have the tribunal, which Alex described, that has been established with the capacity to set standards for this employee-like / regulated road transport worker category that is still contractors, but there's effectively a recognition that the Commission says that, okay, they're contractors, but they lack bargaining power or a few other things, and therefore they need minimum standards. Now, really importantly, the Commission doesn't say, well, as soon as you satisfy that classification, here are the standards you get, and it's a watered down version of employment standards. That is not the approach. What happens is when you are categorized in that way, the union is able to make applications for minimum standards, which can be considered by industry stakeholders through a consultative process. On the other side of that consultative process, we can, if we have agreements, make joint recommendations to the Commission. And then the Commission ultimately has the decision to arbitrate enforceable orders if it thinks it's necessary. The Commission, the tribunal, is bound to make orders that ensure workers are safe, they have access to fairness, they've got sustainable conditions, and businesses are viable as well. And the final point is really importantly in road transport, it's not just horizontally through substitute workers in a market, it's also these standards can be created and imposed through supply chains, which are really important for other reasons that go to the transport industry and how it operates. So that's the system. As soon as that system took effect, we made applications for minimum standards, including, get into what those are, but including rates, consultative procedures, dispute mechanisms, delegates' rights, union representation provisions for food delivery workers. We made a separate application for workers in the last mile industry, including platform workers working for Amazon Flex. And in just last year, we made a follow-up application for platform workers in the rideshare industry. So effectively, just about every platform worker that operates in transport in this country now has an application on foot for minimum standards.
And so what are the minimum standards about? So there are, as I remember right, about pay. They're about access to the workers and representatives, and they're about transparency in algorithmic processes. Is that right?
That's right. So the priorities for us in terms of setting standards first is a real emphasis on rates. We know, in all our engagements with workers, they are being paid far below minimum wage. That's compounding poor safety outcomes. So ensuring we could lift their level of remuneration as far up, as quickly up as we can. The second is really access to representation. If we are able to, through now the standards taking effect, help facilitate the capacity for workers to organise, then that provides them the engine to continue to use this system to continue to lift and improve standards into the future. One of the great things about the system we have in Australia is, again, it's not just you get classified and you get these rights. It is a system, it is an engine, if you will, where workers can continue to organise through, come through to seek better and better standards into the future. So they were our priorities, but in the first application, we pursued a range of really fundamental basic rights for workers. Rates necessarily that are premised on ensuring cost recovery, that workers are able to recover their expenses related to work, but also the basic minimum wage. I'll have a little bit more to say about where we got to on that, because there is a bit of a staged approach in ensuring we achieve those objectives. Consultation mechanisms to ensure workers have a voice, are consulted about work, formal structures in place where delegates and other stewards, if you will, in some countries can access those structures. Dispute mechanisms, if there's issues about rights not being enforced or problems, workers can access simple, effective processes to raise disputes and have them resolved, including with union representation. Transparency, which was a real big one, really big one for platform workers over the years. Provisions that ensure basic information about jobs being offered, payments they would expect from those jobs, where they are travelling to. It sounds like a no-brainer, but of course we know these platforms conceal this information in order to use information asymmetries to pressure workers into accepting jobs and control their work. Minimum insurance, injury insurance, to ensure that it's a dangerous industry. If people are injured, they have access to some level of basic income support and protection. In terms of, I talked about union representation and building that critically, paid leave for delegates, so the right to elect delegates, the right for those delegates to have paid time through a pool of hours to go out, organise, represent the interests of other workers, participate in representation. The right for delegates to be able to communicate with all workers digitally, including by, at the very least, sending in-app or email notifications to every worker across the country, and having the platforms being required to facilitate those communications, and tying that onto a kind of an inductions process where if anyone who starts, a new worker starts on a platform, they receive a generic information statement which contains information about their industrial rights and also the right to join a union, and actually a link to the TW's website. We managed to get in there too, which was a good outcome at the end. So look at that. They are not groundbreaking provisions. They're a first step, but a really important and substantial step in a system which lets us take ongoing steps over the years to continue to improve conditions in this industry.
Yeah, so we say so it's really a basic floor, a first step, and from there you're going to continue to negotiate and advocate for the workers. And if you look to pay, so you already mentioned, okay, also about the occupation-related costs. So in what way do you calculate this minimum pay? So like with the wage indicator, we're working with the living tariff, which is a cost of living based minimum for self-employed or non-employed workers based on the living wage model, which also includes the occupation-related costs and risk. So at what way did you approach the minimum pay, also with regarding questions of, let's say, waiting time?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So generally, we have incredible experience in working this out for truck drivers, owner drivers, couriers, and developing really complex models that work out costs, both variable and fixed costs. Variable being things like fuel and maintenance and other things, and then your fixed costs, which vehicle insurance, registration, items like that. Factoring that in on an hourly basis or on a piecemeal basis to a rate, bolting on your labour component and then working out an effective final rate. Now, for those who want the nuts and bolts of that model, I can say we've just actually commissioned a report through an accounting firm to work out a range of cost models and the different considerations that would go into those as evidence for the proceedings that we're currently involved in. That's public. It's on the Commission's website. So if that's useful, it is a 60-page analysis of how you do that in a really scientific way, but there is that resource, which I'm happy to share to people if that's useful. But conceptually, that's the approach we take. The approach we've had to take in food delivery is not that approach, because rates were so incredibly low, talking half the minimum wage, let alone factoring costs and other conditions, that through the negotiations with these food delivery companies, we reached a position that would effectively increase rates 20-30% on average. Huge initial lift for workers in this industry. But there is a long way to go before we have proper cost recovery in this sector. So it's a first step, like I said before, a really important and vital lift for workers in this sector, which will make a world of difference in their lives, but a lot more work to do. I should add, I missed that point before. At least in the food delivery application, once we made the application, really tense negotiations with the platforms, we did manage to reach an agreement about what those standards, which I just described, would look like. That agreement now goes as a recommendation to the tribunal. We're expecting the tribunal might make tweaks, but largely they will, given that it's got union and platform support, will support that application, and we expect these conditions to be in effect at the end of the year, at least in food delivery.
Yeah, interesting. So what you also say is, so we know in the end the pay should be more, but because we come from so low, we can't improve it directly from day one, because they probably should double or triple the rates. So it's also a step-by-step approach.
It is, and just to give an example of that in actual monetary terms, last mile application where Amazon operates, obviously different market situation, different financial situation, different competitors. We are pushing for effectively a rate that is full cost recovery, which would be around $57 per hour in Australian dollars for Amazon Flex workers. In food delivery, the rate that's been agreed is 31 to 32. And so that shows you I mean, there are two vehicles and vehicles with lower costs, but it shows you the gap between the two. And we're saying 31, 32 was a 20 to 30% increase on current rates. So it really shows you just how low workers were being paid in this industry. Yeah. And it still, after 8 years of campaigning in this sector, it still surprises me, to be completely honest, that we can live in a developed economy like this and see workers be paid so far below minimum wage.
Yeah, interesting. And the definitions of developed is also quite under discussion, especially these days. But that's another discussion, maybe another webinar. So there's also a question from Wojtek in the chat. I think most of the part you already answered, but I just also want to see if you have anything to add on that. So his question is: has implementing the minimum standards actually changed wages? If not, why not? And he also continues: we know from the story of New York City, where the platforms use a completely different definitions of working time than what logic suggested. So that's really also based on the everlasting discussion in on-demand gig work on the waiting time.
So that's a really good question. And sorry, I didn't answer the question on time and how that's factored in. So the rate that we've agreed to will only apply for the, this is platform language, engaged time. So from the moment that an order is accepted to the moment that it's completed. Now, obviously that leaves the online time where someone's waiting for work, not remunerated. That is a challenge, because a big aspect of how we ensure future increases for workers is by ensuring that there is a more efficient allocation of workers throughout the industry, that these platforms are taking responsibility for ensuring they are not oversupplying workers in the sector. That is a challenge that was hard for us to really engage with in a first step, and really hard, not just because there are really real trade-offs between enforcing pay on that time and then flexibility. We've seen in New York, for example, you'd be aware Uber had locked people out of the app once they'd had a mechanism to penalize companies for excessive online time. So there was that question front of our mind. Workers were also incredibly divided about this in our survey. So over the years, we found about 50% of workers would say, no, I want to work in a full roster arrangement with a shift, be paid for every minute I'm online, or actually, no, I just want to make sure I get paid for everything when I accept a job, and then otherwise be able to just stop working whenever I want and jump back on the app whenever I want. So between those two things, they were the challenges. The benefit of engage time, though, is we know in Australia, at least, these platforms aren't paying waiting time when someone's waiting at a restaurant, and they're not paying waiting time when someone's stuck in traffic, and they're not paying waiting time when they go to deliver an order and they can't find the apartment, or something happens, or the person doesn't come out. So there are a lot of components of unpaid time that will now be paid, but not that main component, which I know has sparked so much discussion in so many places around the world.
Yeah, thanks, Fred, and also thanks, Wojtek, for your question. So, if there are many other questions, just send them also in the chat. Oh, there's already one here from Fiona, and then we also go to Alex again. So, question to Jack and Alex: to what extent can those negotiation the ILO draft convention learn from your approach, and what are you hoping to outcome of the ILC, so the International Labour Conference, can potentially bring to the Australian movement? And also to give the context for people who are not aware, so from June 1 to 12, there's the International Labour Conference in Geneva, the ILO, the United Union of Work. And there they're going to discuss the platform work convention. So what can they learn from your perspective? And then I will also go to Alex again from the approach of your union.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, sure. And then we bring in Alex.
Look, I mean, for our union, and we'll be participating in those discussions really directly, along with, I know, many fantastic unions across the country. Across the globe. I think the three principles that stick out in our experience as being the most important is, one, you have to ensure a regulatory system can set standards on an industry-wide basis. There is no point in taking a company-specific approach to regulation or setting standards through, a single agreement by single agreement. That's just not sustainable. It's got to be an industry-wide approach. It has to be an approach that sets standards for all workers, gig, non-gig, regardless of employment status. We cannot keep, chasing long, litigious processes in order to, at the end of that process, have the hope of achieving some kind of effective standards for workers. That has led us to exhaust ourselves in the labour movement and left workers to suffer in the meantime. So we need a really pragmatic approach to being able to effect standards for all workers, employed, non-employed, contractor, non-contractor. They've got to be on an industry-wide basis, but most importantly, unions have to be at the centre of that. And that brings in really interesting questions about how we do make unions at the centre of those regulatory systems when workers are so fragmented, when they're so isolated. What does that kind of effective representation look like in that context?
Yeah, great, thanks. And Alex, also welcome again to the conversation. So can you reflect on this? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I sort of would echo Jack's comments that I think one of the strengths of the Australian approach is that it's not tried to, I guess, fundamentally change the innovative aspects of the platform work, but really try to sort of, I guess, lift all boats. And so the approach that's taken, I think, because it's that sectoral orientation, it really has, I guess, longitudinally it's sustainable in the long run, right? Which I think is really important. And this is really something that if platforms try and reconfigure themselves again, they could still be captured quite easily by this jurisdiction. Is it perfect? No, nothing is perfect when you create something new from the outset. And I think there are areas where, for instance, we're lagging a little bit behind in terms of grappling with things like algorithmic management practices. And because of some of the political compromises that had to be made, There are questions whether certain types of gig work will be captured by the jurisdiction, such as care work. I think there are lessons that can be learned, I guess, in terms of the policy development and how some of the criteria were set. I'm not sure if Jack's in a position to comment around some of the last minute sort of negotiations that took place with the government, but also the crossbenches that amended a few things from what was originally being proposed. And so what we've seen is that clearly food delivery, rideshare, and last mile delivery are now being captured by this new space. I think the other thing we haven't touched upon, but is important to note, is that as part of the employee-like provisions of the Act, there's now an unfair deactivation jurisdiction. So platform workers that are being unfairly deactivated can now make applications at the Fair Work Commission and sort of challenge these deactivations. It's been a bit of a challenge, I think, for workers to begin with to try and get positive outcomes. There's been a major development a few weeks ago in which the Commission is starting to look much more critically at the rating practices of platforms, which should bode well for future workers making these types of applications. So I think, again, that's slightly different to the minimum standard orders and guidelines mechanisms that we have in place, but an important part of this reform that, again, provides another tool to some of the most vulnerable workers in the labor market. Because if you look here in Australia, employees have always had a low-cost jurisdiction in the Fair Work Commission they could go to if they had any grievances around the platforms. It was very difficult for gig workers to go through that route because they first had to demonstrate that they were employees. At least now that has been opened up. Other parts of the reforms that we've seen here is now that workers relating to the workplace relations matters in their contracts can also turn to the Commission and ask for an unfair contract term adjudication. So again, the government made it possible for workers to, I guess, not have to go through the far more costly option of the courts, but to go to the low-cost jurisdiction of the Fair Work Commission to basically say, the agreement that we have with a platform really has some particular unfair clauses relating to how work is being performed or asked to be performed. So I think that's worth noting as well. So I think, yeah, there's some valuable lessons around the Australian experience in addition to what Jack has already said. I think the other thing to mention, and just to clarify again, the way that the process here works is that it really goes through a process before the Commission that Jack was speaking to, but it also has allowed other parties to contribute, to raise objections, to sort of, I guess, share their positions. But one of the things that we're still seeing is that some parties, even though the TWU has reached this agreement with Uber and DoorDash, which represent the vast majority of the market, Amazon is raising still some objections, if I'm understanding it correctly, around what is the definition of the sector, because we've got these different instruments that can potentially come into place. And so, again, anyone looking at sort of regulations in international comparisons, it might be worthwhile to look at those issues that are being raised, and all that documentation is in those links that were shared earlier. It's all publicly available documentation. You can read the various types of objections that some of the parties are making, which I think provide valuable lessons for other people going down this route. It's not to say that there's a problem with the architecture we have here, but it's highlighting the fact that because of the way the architecture is set up, and we can have multiple applications that may have some crossover effects, that there are parties that will try and complicate these matters and will make arguments that we can't have standards for platform workers that are X and last mile delivery workers that are Y. Not sure if you wanted to add anything to that, Jack, because I think that is a really interesting part that's perhaps the bit that remains a little bit unsettled now before we really get the Commission's decision around this.
Yeah, look, you're right. It is really interesting. And of course, coverage is a strategic, heated discussion in Australia at the moment, because of course we're arguing that Amazon must immediately be subject to higher standards because of its dominance, its impact on supply chains, than otherwise some of these food delivery platforms. And because of that approach that we've taken, they are obviously opposing that, trying to seek lower minimum standards, and that has really ignited this debate about coverage. So that's the context there, which Alex was alluding to. Of course, you'll see copious amounts of evidence, including Amazon cross-examining me with one of the best barristers in the country for 2 hours on Monday. So enjoy reading for those who are interested in game enough to look into that. But if there's any follow-up questions people have about that, happy to connect separate to this.
Yeah, cool. So we also share a blog end of next week where we also will include the links. Also, the question of Anna of the accounting report. We will also share the link in that, so that will be sent to you within a week. There's one question I think for Jack from Anna. She says, how do you connect authority level lobbying and negotiations with direct worker engagements? You mentioned surveying workers and protests. Do you have any other tactics for connecting the two levels? Thanks for your answer.
And sorry, just so I'm clear, the two levels were?
How do you connect authority level lobbying and negotiations with direct worker engagements? Maybe Anna, maybe you can also open your mic and maybe also your camera to elaborate on that.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you so much. Yeah, sorry if I was not clear. For me, I'm an organizer working on field, and there is often there's quite a big gap between like high-level authority lobbying and effectively trying to change legislation. So all these like technical negotiations that you were mentioning, which are incredibly important, but can be quite disengaging on a worker level. And so I was just interested, like, how do you connect the two? And for me, like what you mentioned from those, like surveying was one, which can engage workers, but can be directly used within the negotiation processes and protests. But I was just wondering if like, do you actually put effort in this, or is this a focus to connect the two levels, or are these, so how do you, yes, this is what I meant. Thank you so much.
And it's such a great question and such a genuine challenge. And it's a genuine challenge for union organising more broadly, particularly when you have very long campaigns and particularly where they're focused on legal processes and outcomes. How do you sustain momentum and worker organising and action through those processes? And then add to that the challenges of having an incredibly fragmented transient workforce that's spread out across the country and having a campaign that takes 8 years to effectively deliver those outcomes. There is no simple answer to that. I think first we were really realistic about what our objectives were when we said being innovative in organising and having a worker-centred approach. We knew we weren't going to be able to effectively organise 70-80% of workers into the union across an industry like this. We focused really on identifying activists and leaders who were deeply committed, deeply engaged, and they tended to be people who were doing the work full time, were genuinely committed to the industry. And of course, some of those came and went, but over the years, we ended up in a position where pre-regulation, we had a few hundred workers in the union who were kind of really strong advocates, strong activists, proper union leaders who were in there for the fight and were in there for the long term. They were the nucleus of everything we did when we were lobbying in Parliament, having discussions with platforms. We were in the courts, putting pressure legally. Even when we were negotiating the minimum standards orders, they've been at the centre of it. So there was that approach, imperfect, but really important. But I will say, Alex touched on the deactivation protections applying. The second they applied, we've seen our union membership consistently grow at unprecedented rates to the point where we're approaching 2,000 members and we expect that to continue to grow into the future. So just by having some basic universal rights that can immediately support workers was also a really important thing whilst we were pursuing the other minimum standards into the future.
Okay, thanks for that. And it's time flies. It's already 10 o'clock here in Netherlands. It's 6 o'clock in Australia and many other times in different time zones. So I would like to wrap up the webinar. So I think we could continue this conversation for hours. And I think maybe we could also do a follow-up webinar in the later stage, also after the ILC, on also, okay, what happened and so what are the next steps. So I want to thank Jack and Alex for your contribution. It's really, really inspiring case. In next week, we're also going to have a webinar where the link is also now in the chat, where we run a webinar on AI runs on human labor, but at what price? A session we intentionally had organized for RightsCon, but the RightsCon was cancelled to do some horrific events. So next week we will also share the blog where we also include the links that were mentioned today. Wojtek, I will also include also the answer on your question also within the blog. So thanks very much also for joining this webinar. Thanks Alex and Jack, and also my colleagues from Wage Indicator for helping me in this. And let's keep the conversation going. And I wish you all a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks for having
Bye.
us.